Well, here we are in the second week of our message series that we are calling The Power of Patient Love. We have all heard about the power of love and may very well have experienced it, I hope, in our lives. But the point of this series is to remind us, as Jesus himself does, that patience is also powerful and that patience and love are deeply connected. And finally, to share some things that might help us to grow in patience and so then also in love. Because if love is powerful, patient love is very powerful. St. Paul, inspired by the Holy Spirit, knew that. And if you have ever attended a Catholic or a Christian wedding, chances are good that you have heard him say so in one of the Bible readings very often proclaimed on those occasions. You might remember how Paul's story of love begins. In case you have forgotten, here it is. Love is patient. And patience and love are even more deeply connected because patience, like love, is easy to admire, but sometimes very difficult to attain. Last week, we considered God as a model of patient love. We considered the story Jesus told his disciples about the weeds planted among the wheat. We saw how the farmer in that story's patience in waiting for the harvest before removing the weeds is an image of God's patient love for his world and for his children. And we realize that standing before God, we are all children, however old we might be, and as children, we are not yet everything that we are capable of becoming. And so, like the farmer in the gospel, God is patient with us, giving us nourishment, the encouragement, and the time we need to grow if we are willing. And we learned that just as God is patient with us, for us to grow in patience, we also need to be patient with God, to trust in his good purposes for us and for our world, to be a hopeful people. And this hope, our trust in God and in his good purposes, even when circumstances don't easily suggest it, this hope is also the foundation of our Christian patience. Patience with God, but also the kind of patience we're looking at today, patience with each other. And for most of us, this is what we think of when we hear the word patience, or the opposite, impatience. We know, yes, that we should be patient with God, at least based on this little theological image that I've pulled forth for you. And we know certainly in our faith that we should trust God. But when most of us hear that word, patience, and think about it, or perhaps think about its absence in our life, we're more likely to think about our relationship with one another. We're more likely to think about situations like this. I'm going to give you a few examples. You could doubtless have many of your own. Standing in line at the grocery store or maybe at the drugstore and kind of being in a bit of a rush and going crazy while the cashier and the customer at the front of the line seem to be having a very leisurely conversation. Or the same thing happening in a restaurant when you're waiting to be seated. Staff are talking with each other. They're not waiting on you. Another one, seeing the number of an incoming call on your phone and just sending it to voicemail or not answering it because I don't have time right now for the kind of conversation that I know this call will bring. Or losing our patience snapping at someone when perhaps it's a young child, perhaps an aging parent, when they ask a question that we have already answered, it seems, 1,000 times before. Each of us has our own examples, and I'd encourage you to think of a few from your own life. Each of us has our own examples of this. They are all real, they are all different, but in a certain sense, they are also the same. We are all impatient at one moment or another. When that happens, I think it's true, we're disappointed in ourselves, and we would like to do better. But I'm not sure that we always see the stakes in this particular failing as very high. I can tell you that impatience is something that we priests here regularly confessed. I have confessed it myself on numerous occasions, but sometimes, in reflecting on my confessions, at least I wonder if the reason I'm so willing to confess it is because I really don't think it's all that big of a deal. But if patience can be powerful in a positive way, its absence, impatience, can also be powerful, and not in a way that we would desire. And that is important to remember, because the only road to a patient Love is a patient life. The only road to a patient love is a patient life. And a patient life, or for that matter, even a patient moment in our life, isn't always easy to achieve, as we know. It's interesting in another context to think that the word we use for someone in the hospital or under a doctor's care is patient. Now, of course, in the particular instance, given our personality and the seriousness of our condition, exactly how patient a patient we might be will vary considerably. But the fact that the word has been used in that way teaches us something, and I think it teaches us something that today is countercultural, something that runs against the way we generally look at and attack and enter into our life. Patience, if you or I were asked just off the cuff, we would most likely say, and we would be correct so far as we go, we would say that patience involves waiting. But if we were to draw a lesson from the way that word is used in medicine, as I've just described, it seems that patience might also involve suffering. And suffering isn't easy. Now, before you tune me out completely, the suffering I'm talking about isn't necessarily physical suffering. Because there is another older meaning to that word that is also very important. And according to the older meaning, to suffer can also mean to be willing to allow certain things to happen in our life. Sometimes, yes, there are things we cannot control, and so in that sense it's easy. But sometimes also, according to that older meaning of the word, there are things that we could control, but choose not to. Instead, we choose to accept them, to suffer them, in the older sense of that word. And that is countercultural. Think back to us standing in line at the grocery store or the phone call we decide we just don't have what it takes to answer at that moment. At our worst, in those situations, you and I choose to avoid those things. At our best, we choose to suffer some of them. And as we do that, we take a step at least on the road to patient love. Because we choose, at least in that particular situation, we choose to live a patient life. And a patient life is the road to patient love. So how do we choose a patient life? Well, moment by moment, as the examples I've just given you suggest, it's true, but we can begin, very fruitfully I believe, we can begin by asking for God's help. In the Christian tradition, patience is described as one of the fruits of the Holy Spirit. It is part of the harvest that can come from allowing God to take root in our life and in our heart. And it's not the only part. Let's listen to a full list just to get a sense of whether or not it appeals to us. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Now, if you have ever received the sacrament of confirmation, you'll probably remember all, or at least part, of that list. But even if you have not, even if you yourself are not a Christian at all, I think it's still a very attractive list. It's attractive, but like patience itself, it is in a certain sense countercultural. Because if we think back to that list, for the most part, the fruits of the Spirit aren't about me. They are about how I relate to others. Just think about it from the other side. Wouldn't you want your friends, your family, your spouse, your neighbors to be always around you, patient, kind, generous, self-controlled, and faithful? What would that be like? Amazing. Powerful. And the same goes for you and me. We are not the ones who harvest the fruit of the Spirit in our life. It is others, our friends, our family, our spouse, our neighbors. But that is not quite the whole story. You might have noticed, if you remember that list in its fullness, that I skipped the first few items on the list when I talked about others reaping the harvest. I skipped the first few items: love, joy, peace. All of us, whoever we are and whatever we believe, are looking for these things. And the Bible, in that passage and elsewhere, teaches us that love, joy, and peace come to us first as gifts. But without patience with God, and trust in his good purposes for us and for our world, we end up impatient. We end up believing that we have to find them for ourselves. They won't be given to us. That we need somehow to create the circumstances and the situations in our life where these things will be possible. Manufacture them, we could say. And so, achieving our desires, those things that we think will bring us joy, love, and peace, comes to seem to us to be the only possible road to joy and happiness. And then being told we cannot have what we desire feels unjust and oppressive. We become impatient. We continue to be perhaps impatient. After all, we say, we were made for this. And we are made for love, joy, and peace. It's just that to fully experience them, we have to be willing first to accept them as gifts, to be patient. Last week, we heard Jesus teaching us about the kingdom. And I said that the kingdom that Jesus proclaims is the coming of God's rule in our life and in our world. The coming, we could say, of love, joy, and peace. And today, once again, Jesus is teaching us about the kingdom. The kingdom of heaven, he says, is like a treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. Then, in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all he had and bought it. Now, the purpose of our life is to find the treasure of the kingdom. But the meaning of our life will be determined by whether we recognize it when we see it, when we find it. Are we willing to be patient in our search? Patient when things do not go as we desire, when others don't give us what we expect and desire and even perhaps deserve. It happens to us all. We are all on this search, this journey. We are all looking for patient love. But can we walk the road of the patient life that allows us to find it? Now, just yesterday, Pope Francis offered us all some hope and some comfort that we can do exactly that. I opened my phone, probably shouldn't have done it, it's a distraction, and there it was, a tweet from the Holy Father. He said this: the true pilgrim, person on a journey, the true pilgrim is capable of going at the pace of the slowest person. And Jesus is capable of this. Jesus is our pilgrim companion. He respects our situation and does not accelerate the pace. He is the Lord of patience. So let's cast our mind back to those everyday examples of impatience, the ones that I talked about, or maybe it would be the one from your own life that came to mind as I did. Now, if you are like me, in those circumstances, in those situations, you don't always choose patient love. But Jesus respects our situation. He does not accelerate the pace. He accompanies each of us as we journey through life, no matter how hesitating and hesitant our steps might be. He accompanies us, giving us the chance to choose again. Again and again, he places these circumstances in our life and gives us the chance again and again to choose patient love. That is our hope. And so, a little bit of homework. I'm going to ask you to think back to last week, when you might remember that I asked you to come up with a list of the top 2 or 3 people or situations where you believe you could grow in patience. And if you missed it last week, well, it's not that complicated. You can do it now. But just cast your mind back to those top 2 or 3 situations or people where you need to grow in patience. And over the course of this week, call each of them to mind during your quiet time with God every day. And ask Him, ask the Lord of patience, to help you be patient. To learn to go at their pace, if it's people or the situation, not yours. To walk with them as a patient companion. Number one. Second, to get ready for next week, take a few minutes of your quiet time and ask God to show you a couple of places in your own life where you might not be patient enough with yourself, because that also is something that happens regularly in our life. Take a few minutes and ask God to show you some places in your life where you're not being patient enough with yourself. All of this, the road of a patient life, step by step, choice by choice, all of this is challenging, and we need the Lord's help in order to do it. It is difficult, it is challenging, countercultural, as I said, to accept, to suffer difficult situations and people, to be willing to go at their pace and to accompany them at their speed. But we don't have to do it on our own. If we ask the Lord, He will strengthen us for the task and help us to begin to walk the road of a patient life, a road that will lead us to develop a truly powerful, patient love.